Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. The election of Donald Trump has brought many dramatic changes in society south of the border, with anti-immigrant policies leading to ICE raids and deportations, the DOGE cuts to U.S. aid and other institutions, his so-called anti-woke policies against DEI, with many major corporations and educational institutions in the United States rolling back their DEI policies and programs for fear of retribution from the Trump administration. Some of that has already seeped over the border into Canada, with top sponsors of the nonprofit Pride Toronto, well-known brands like Google, Home Depot, Nissan, and Clorox pulling out of their sponsorships. We wondered if there were other impacts on Canada's nonprofit sector that we should be keeping a close eye on. To help us unpack some of the latest developments, please welcome Dean Delpeache. For the last decade, Dean has been focused on talent management and creating frameworks of equity for organizations. Through his consultancy, Strasity, he helps organizations design strategic frameworks focused on diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity, DIBE. Dean is also a professor and program lead of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Workplace program at George Brown College, and is a global conference speaker, delivering talks and workshops to both students and industry professionals as a vocal advocate for creating equitable workplaces. Welcome to the podcast, Dean.
Oh, Mary, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Well, I'm curious from your, really important perspective. Have you seen recent DEI rollbacks in Canada that reflect some of the things that are going on in the United States? In other words, are we seeing the recent DEI rollbacks in the US affecting the work that you're doing with Canadian nonprofits and institutions?
What we're really seeing as an organization, particularly with the not-for-profits that we work with, is we're looking and noticing that people are asking, number one, for advice. How are we actually to deal with what is going on? Should we be concerned if corporate funders start to pull back, money based on this? And so what we're finding is we're helping organizations to navigate. And what we're noticing is that companies want to start potentially an evolution of the wording and terminology around these terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and looking for a way to align, with what's happening in the US, but still be intentional about what's going on. So what we've noticed is companies, particularly, in the not-for-profit sector, saying, listen, we want to keep the same principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, anti-oppression, but why don't we frame it as more of a culture of inclusion? Why don't we think about it more from that perspective for our employees, and the work that we do continue to be mission driven? But then we're also seeing, other organizations in this sector double down, to be honest with you, Mary, on the terms and saying, no, the difference between us is we are mission driven. We're not for profit driven. And because of that, we want to continue with the mission of serving equity seeking groups and other communities. And so the work of justice, the work of anti-oppression still remains, and we want to ensure that we are highlighting that. And a lot of the organizations we've talked to have also, consulted with some of their funders, and depending on who that might be and where the funding is coming from, these funders are actually saying, no, that's fine, but let's continue with that because we still want to do the work. And so it really depends. But ultimately, companies are focusing on, what are our funders thinking and saying, and how can we approach the work and still retain what we're doing.
So there's a change or an evolution in semantics, it sounds like, with some of the organizations you're working with. But you're convinced that this isn't a step back or an echo of what's going on in the United States?
Well, for the not-for-profit sector in particular, again, I think it's about, what we're hearing is it's about the mission. We want to focus on the mission. And for the most part, not-for-profits are present to serve communities that, typically may need support in different areas, irrespective. And we find in a lot of those those missions, we have equity seeking groups. So they want to make sure that they're still focused on the mission and being intentional about the mission, and that the organization continues to reflect those who they are serving. And so with that said, they're being cautious with regards to stopping, halting, changing direction, if I can use that terminology, in terms of the work. But they're also considering, should we pivot and align with regards to the wording? And so it's really just looking at the terminology, but not stopping the work.
Okay, well, that's encouraging. I'm curious whether you're seeing increased pressure or a fear of increased pressure to soften and reframe the DEI initiatives themselves to align with the shifting corporate funding priorities. Like, are the actual programs being changed anywhere in the area in which you worked, especially those that were influenced or are influenced by the US climate?
Yeah. So if you have, for example, a not-for-profit where, let's say, their corporate funding is typically coming from organizations who their head offices are based in the U.S., and those organizations may be federal contractors, and receive money from the federal government. Well, yes, you may be seeing a softening trickle down, and that's probably the best way I could say it, based on the fact that we still want to continue to keep this corporate funding. It's an important part of the work that we do. So let's ensure that we're more so aligning to activities that speak to, and I think the real highlight word as of late is that word inclusion, right? And so you might be seeing, for example, the softening on the terminology of the word equity, because what's happening is there's a push in the US to say that we don't want to create equity-based outcomes, right? But we still want to create access, which is really, I mean, the use of the word equity. But we still want to continue to proceed with programs that help support it. We're just not going to shout it on the mountaintops like we used to, right? Over the last few years. So I think depending on the organization, and again, kind of coming back to the beginning of where maybe they're getting their funding and their sponsorship support, they may consider the softening. But in Canada specifically, we're still seeing, again, we still want to do the work. And I think that's really important to highlight.
So I guess it's sort of a reaction to the meritocracy that has been embraced
Yes.
by the Trump administration and
Yes.
vaunted in terms of their hiring practices. And I'm curious, are organizations in Canada changing how they approach hiring and retention to avoid being seen as too political? What are the consequences of that kind of recalibration?
Yeah. Great question. If you go through the actual executive orders in the US, if you really kind of go through them and think, it's really about what they call workforce shaping, right? And so they call the principles of DEI and programs that are related to it illegal because they have the potential to shape the workforce and the outcomes that may be there. So what you're actually seeing is that some organizations are looking at it from the perspective of, okay, we don't want to be considered workforce shaping. We want to align with, the law and legal approach. So therefore, what we may not do is we may not have targets. We might not have goals that say by 2029, the proportion of Black employees must be at the same level as the community that we serve. That's where you're seeing kind of that softening on the targets and the goals because it could represent workforce shaping. And so activities that may specifically target that, there's a term that is used called candidate slates, where you want to make sure that the pool of candidates have, you know, um, let's say out of 5 candidates, 3 of them are people of color, right? What you might find is that might be removed, but companies are still sourcing talent from broad pools across many different dimensions. And I think another thing I should say too, Mary, with that too, is even though companies are still looking at different demographics and making sure that we're intentionally sourcing, you're seeing a broadening perspective from the pool where it's not just race and gender, let's say, because in the US, that's a very big primary focus. but you're seeing that it's spreading across the board to neurodiversity, a refocus on individuals who may have disabilities or people who are differently abled, and looking at it from that perspective. I think the spillover in Canada is really more of, okay, should we be aligning our programs to reflect this? Because again, we want to ensure that we can continue with the funding that we've continued in the past or things of that nature. And so I haven't in Canada seen it yet where companies are saying, I'm going to eliminate our goals now, or we're eliminating these things. But if companies are starting to create frameworks, they're not saying we want goals in that direction now. They're looking at, let's just continue to be intentional around making sure we have diverse pools of candidates.
So there could be some sliding going. Um, it's just a question of how you frame it, is if I'm understanding you correctly. And it may be too early to say what's happening in Canada.
Again, Canada and even the UK, to me, I look at it more as a trickle down effect from what's happening in the US. So not everything is relevant to us in Canada, but there may be some things that are relevant based on, you know, is our organization headquartered in the US? Do we have funders who are headquartered in the US who are in Canada and have to abide by and align with? So I think that's where you're really seeing it come down.
Right. And how do you see younger talent engaging with DEI today? Is there a generational gap in how these conversations are approached within organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think young people, particularly like Gen Z, and now we have the new terminology, I think it's called Generation Alpha now. What they want is to work for companies that are doing social good at the end of the day. They want to ensure that whatever organization that they're a part of, they can bring their skills and their talents, but at the same time, is that company impacting, the social welfare of individuals, and I can name different organizations who really attempt to at least appear to do that. But I think where and when I have spoken to Gen Z talent, that is what's really really important to them. They'll go to school for engineering, but they want to be engineers and also want to do social good. So what you're finding is this Gen Z talent is where they're in organizations where there are affinity groups, employment resource groups. You're seeing them getting involved and really actually honing on their leadership skills through those types of community opportunities to work with different demographics, but as well as within the community. And so I think where you see the what I call the ground up push is from this talent to say, hey, like, let's be socially responsible. Let's ensure that we're supporting organizations who are doing this great mission work, and they're seeing that impact. And I think there's a message there too, Mary, where if not-for-profits can really speak to that generation and impress the importance of for us, mission service, volunteerism, and it's important for social impact, they can actually from the ground up speak to organizations and their leadership and say, this is important to us if we're going to work for your organization and bring our talents there.
Yeah, it's interesting. It wasn't long ago when I was working with our sister company, um, where our whole purpose was to recruit young people and Gen Z, and was very much inclined to welcome a an employer who actually did have diversity, equity, and inclusion programs as part of their fundamental culture. And that was very much something that employers were uh, quite aware of and committed to provide as not just a principled reason to have the appropriate equitable culture within their organizations, but because it made a lot of sense, both in terms of public relations, but also as part of their recruitment strategy. Is that changing now?
From an organizational perspective, is that changing?
Yes.
I'm going to actually share something. And it's funny, as you were talking, I was literally thinking about this. I attend a lot of conferences where you will have them focused on maybe a specific demographic. Um, and in that, you will have hundreds of employers who are there on a career floor, trying to attract this Gen Z, Gen Alpha talent. And Mary, I kid you not, the taglines still read inclusive culture, diversity inclusion is our core, those types of statements. And you will find, and I've talked to them, these younger workers, you'll find when you ask questions like, what made you approach that booth? Oh, I saw that tagline around diversity inclusion. It attracted me to go to that booth, and it wasn't just about their skill set and engineering. They actually want to be in a culture that is important to them. Just even one more thought. I remember being on a client call who was trying to hire talent from different backgrounds, and I kid you not, I remember one specific call for a sales role where the actual candidate said, when it was asked, what did you have some questions? The first question was, what is your program around diversity inclusion? Not what the sales role was about. They want to know about the culture and how important, and that's very important to them. So I think I think companies are, maybe aligning in different terminology because of what's going on, but not changing because they want to make sure they attract that talent.
Got it. Well, some leaders, we've talked about this a little earlier, some leaders are worried about alienating or polarized donors or funders. Um, what advice do you give to nonprofits who are trying to navigate principled DEI work while facing external pushback?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing, Mary, is you need to have a conversation with your donors and really understand where they align on this topic. And just have a conversation to understand, are you feeling pressure? Are you finding pressure within your organization to make changes? How are you adapting? Um, is your organization requiring the companies that you're funding to adapt in a different way? I think it starts with that conversation with your donors. But then parallel to that conversation, there's a leadership discussion that needs to happen. What Where do we fall and where do we stand when it comes to our mission, what we're trying to provide to equity seeking groups, and how we want our employees to experience our culture and the values? And I think once we can align on those two things and come to an alignment, then that will tell us where we need to move our strategy and the frameworks that we're working with regarding these principles of diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity. And I think that's very, very important. And so if I think we focus on those two things, just to start, and be flexible. I think that's another thing too, Mary. Our times are changing. Things change literally every single day. You think about it. The Trump administration could put out, we're rolling back we're rescinding previous executive orders and starting new ones, but then after it goes to court, and then there's legal battles, and then it's a back and forth. So be flexible with that. But I think that's where I would start. Align with your donors, align with leadership values for the organization, come to alignment on both, and then we can move forward.
So we've talked about the difference between the corporate and nonprofit worlds, and the difference between the US experience and what's going on in Canada, particularly for those two sectors. In an environment where DEI work is under scrutiny, how can organizations move from performative kind of behavior to sustainable practice, from checkboxes to frameworks, particularly focusing in the world of a nonprofit?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, focusing on a not-for-profit, what's our mission? Who is the communities that we serve? And within that, the majority of non-for-profits are going to find that the communities they serve have within them communities of equity-seeking groups. That's number one. Is our organization reflective of the people that we are serving? Do we have people within our organization in place that can serve those communities because they actually understand their experiences, they understand the environments that they're in to appropriately serve, but also to solve problems, because that's what we're here to do too, and to innovate on that. And I think once we can do that, then we can align our programs internally within the organization to truly reflect that. And I say, keep the staple of what you're doing focused on the word inclusion. And the reason I use that word inclusion is because what we really want to see is individuals from all walks of life and background, whether come into our workplace, feel included where they can do their best work. That's where they feel like they can belong. And as well, if they're included, you know, we would hope that equity is a part of that and that they're getting access, accommodations, etc. Focus on that word inclusion. And I would start with the leadership. Focus on creating supporting behaviors that model inclusion. That's the foundation of that organization. Then focus on creating team norms of inclusion where each team really focuses on how they can perform better and be more productive, but in an environment where everyone can feel like they belong. When they can do that and do their best work, then they're going to serve those equity serving deserving groups in stronger, more passionate ways and really, really reach out to the mission. So I think that is where I would really start. Just focus on making sure that word inclusion really is modeled in your organization, and you will model it in the mission so that these DEI quote unquote practices don't need to dissolve or go away. You're still focusing on what's really, really matters.
Right. It's just, I guess, perceived or framed in a different way.
Absolutely. I think, well, to be quite honest, we've been trying to do this work forever. I think this is really the cry of the quote unquote civil rights movement. This is the cry. Like if you think about the civil rights movement, what was it really about? It was about ensuring that everyone can work within an organization and not feel segregated. That's really belonging at its core. You want everyone to come to work at a company and feel like they belong and not feel that they have to, quiver to because they're of a certain color or a certain background, etc. And so really all we're doing is throughout time, maybe changing the language. The principle is still the same. We want everyone to feel included so they can do their best work.
And what are some of the common misconceptions nonprofit leaders have about what DEI work actually requires? And how can they shift from viewing it as a short term initiative to a longer term organizational commitment or a cultural aspect of what they are internally for their employees?
Mary, I love that question. Typically what happens is, and again, let's go back to George Floyd being the untimely death and unfortunate death of George Floyd. There becomes this rise of social justice. People start to say we've got to do something, and the first thing most companies did was either put out statements, maybe made donations, but they formed diversity inclusion committees. And when they formed these committees, they formed them with good intentions, but a lot of people in these committees are people that are really just passionate about the work, but don't necessarily know how to create a long-term sustainable program. So where we come in and help and support organizations is what we'll do is we will actually create a strategy and a framework for every area and aspect of what you do, from your talent acquisition strategy and how you attract people to the vendors that you work with, just looking at every aspect, and also to the mission that you're focused on and making sure that it still remains equitable and inclusive. And so I think what I would do if I was an organizational leader is say, have we created a framework? Have we created a strategy that really can be sustainable? If we have not, what do we need to do to get there? Do we have the resources internally to work on that? Do we need to get someone externally to help support? Create the strategy. And once that strategy is created, then you want to really move to change management phase, which is about communicating the strategy, implementing the actions, measuring what you've implemented, and reporting on what is measured. Because a lot of people will say, yeah, they talked a big talk, but then after I saw no change. If you can get to a point where you're reporting on what has occurred and people can actually see change and evolution, then you will have a sustainable program.
And how can nonprofit leaders hold space for hard conversations on race and belonging or systemic inequities without shutting people down, especially those conversations if they get uncomfortable or divisive?
Yeah, absolutely. I think from an organizational perspective, one of the strongest things I've seen in an organization is something that we call courageous conversations. And you can call that any term you want, but it's when whether it's the leadership team or leaders can bring the staff together and say we want to improve the experience and the well-being of employees. And today we're going to talk about a really important topic, which is belonging. We want to ensure every employee feels a sense of belonging and would love to know, what are your thoughts? How do you think we can get there? What changes should we make? Are there examples of things that you're seeing are working? Are there things that you're seeing that are not working? Just questions. I'll give your employees the chance to speak. When you do that, you're going to create a list of ideas, Mary. Believe it or not, a list of ideas that people are going to bring to the table that you can go back and say, which ones should we prioritize? Short term, medium term, long term. Start working on those ideas and then start to measure and again report back to the employees. You gave us these ideas. This is what we are seeing done. That is a fantastic way just to have the conversation in a way that's not polarizing. You're not calling out anybody, but you're giving people the opportunity. Have these quarterly. And as you go down the road, start to allow the words maybe to even get more specific, because people are starting to build trust and get comfortable to the point where it might be about, you know, what do you think about racism in the workplace? You might get to that point. And it's not day one, but it might be day 365. But employees have been prepped already to have these conversations. And I've seen this done with organizations that I've helped to, support, where they'll call me in to have and facilitate these conversations and moderate. And they've gotten to places where employees are now saying, can we go deeper? Can we go deeper? And that's what you want. Build that trust over time.
And are there any success stories or strategies you've seen that help organizations stay true to their DEI commitments, even amid this kind of resistance and pullback and pushback that we've seen south of the border?
Yeah, absolutely. One one organization in particular that we have worked with over time. Again, they kind of start off with that diversity and inclusion committee, but then the committee wanted more. They wanted the organization to do more, and so what the organization decided to do is they thought, we need external help. Brought us in. We did interviews, sat with the employees really to understand, created focus groups, built a strategy. And as we implemented the strategy, we implemented it with the diversity and inclusion committee, but we also set up subgroups, right? And we'd always go back and learn and get feedback and gain that feedback with those groups. What that resulted in is it resulted in their employment engagement scores increasing year over year, because and employees starting to state in the comments, it's because you're listening to us, it's because you're actually actioning on these things. I think at the end of the day, Mary, that is the biggest thing that employees want. They understand, right, that this type of work is challenging to do, but all they want in the end of the day is, show us the action. And are you measuring it? And as you go along, and you'll find employees will buy in. And again, I think a lot of people think these are programs, and it's not programs. This is a change management strategy, and change takes time. And I think that's really important to say.
Hmm. And looking ahead, what's one shift you believe Canadian nonprofits must make to protect and advance equity work in the face of growing external pressure?
Yeah. Um, I don't know if it's a complete shift, Mary, but I think that it is a refocus on the mission. Why do we exist? Who are we serving? Does our organization reflect who we're serving? And what are we doing internally to make sure that our employees feel like they can serve that organization? And I think that it is in these times like now, and as I kind of mentioned earlier, if you actually go through a timeline of history, you will see, right, with the not-for-profit sector, they stay consistent while, the for-profit will go up and down depending on what's going on. I think it's just continually in those times when you see a downturn, revisiting why we are doing this, what our values are, why it's important, and keep moving forward. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, Mary, that word inclusion, I don't believe it's going to go away, because that's the core of the work of that we've been doing over the past 100 or so years around this. And so I think we can focus in on that and make sure we're working towards that.
Well, Dan, thanks so much for your insights and advice for nonprofit leaders who may be struggling to navigate these challenging times while continuing to promote DEI within their organizations. Thank you for joining Charity Village Connects.
Mary, thank you for the time. Appreciate it.